Lena stood outside the door, her hand trembling as it hovered over the handle of room 917. The hallway of the luxury hospital wing was dim and silent, save for the faint hum of ventilation and the low buzz of nerves crawling up her spine. She had never done anything like this before, not even close. But somehow, here she was, wearing a borrowed dress that clung too tight, heels that pinched her toes, and makeup she didn't recognize on her own face. The plan wasn't hers. It belonged to Amanda, her overly confident roommate who had too much wine and too many ideas on Lena's final night as a nursing intern. The dare had sounded like a joke at first, one last wild memory before graduation, one ridiculous moment to mark the end of years spent hiding behind textbooks and quiet corners. Amanda's voice echoed in her head. Just knock on his door, pretend to be someone he didn't expect. A fantasy, not a nurse. One night of boldness. He won't even remember you tomorrow. Lena hadn't told Amanda the truth. She hadn't told anyone. That she knew who was behind the door. That she had spent the past 6 weeks watching him from a careful distance, reading every chart, listening to every muted conversation from the hallway. Damien Cross, 34, CEO of Cross and Vale Industries, a man both feared and admired. He had been recovering quietly after a car accident that fractured his leg and nearly killed him. Most patients in the VIP suite came with demands and pretension. Damien came with silence. He read old books, drank his coffee black, thanked every nurse with a slight nod. But it wasn't his money or name that had caught her attention. It was the way he carried loneliness like it belonged to him, the way he never looked at his phone, the way he once asked the nurse at the desk if there was a piano on the floor, just to hear something real. Lena had answered from the shadows that there wasn't. He had smiled at her then, faint and fleeting, but it had landed in her chest and stayed there. Tonight, he was being discharged. This was her last chance, not to confess, not to beg. But maybe, just maybe, to be remembered. She stared at the door for another breath, then knocked twice, gently. No answer. Then a third, firmer. The door opened. Damien stood there in a black robe over plain clothes, his cane leaning against the wall, his expression unreadable. He looked at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. She froze. Then her voice came, shaky and too soft. "Good evening. I was told you requested company." His brow lifted, just slightly. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. Instead, he stepped aside and said, "Come in." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She walked past him slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the perfume on her skin foreign and artificial. The door clicked shut behind her. She had no idea what she was doing. But for once, she didn't run. The room was nothing like the others on the recovery floor. It didn't feel like a hospital suite. It felt like a temporary sanctuary, stripped of sterile beeps and institutional coldness. A low lamp cast warm light across a minimalist couch, a table with stacked books, and a kettle of tea still steaming. Damien didn't offer her a seat. He didn't approach her either. He simply stood there for a long moment, studying her the way one studies silence, not to break it, but to understand it. "So," he said finally, his voice low, not unkind, "you're not the regular type they send up here." Lena's throat tightened. She forced a shrug, as if the costume she wore came with the confidence she lacked. "Maybe I'm a gift," she replied, though the words came out like a line she had memorized without conviction. "Maybe," he echoed, not moving, "or maybe you're lost." She almost laughed. If he only knew how accurate that was. The truth? She wasn't even supposed to be here. She had 5 hours left on her final shift before returning to a dorm room she couldn't afford, and a life plan held together by duct tape and overdue bills. No one in her world played games with billionaires, and no one, especially not her, was foolish enough to fall in love with one. But Lena had fallen anyway. not in the way her classmates obsessed over celebrity gossip or Instagram profiles. She had fallen during the third week of her internship, when Damien had asked her quietly if there were any books in the hospital worth reading. She had slipped a copy of The Little Prince under his tray the next morning, with no note. He never asked who brought it, but she saw him reading it 3 nights in a row. She didn't know how to explain what that did to her. She didn't know how to explain that in a hospital full of broken things, he was the only one who didn't look like he needed fixing, but still felt like he could fall apart. Her story wasn't glamorous. She wasn't an heiress pretending to blend in. She was the daughter of a woman who scrubbed motel bathrooms and a father who disappeared when she was 12. She grew up in a 1-bedroom flat, memorized the sound of eviction notices, and learned early that fairy tales came with bills nobody else paid. Love, to her, was something you watched from across the street, something you folded into poems but never read aloud. So no, she wasn't brave, not in the ways that mattered. But tonight, she had dared herself, not for her friends, not for the thrill, but because she had spent 6 weeks loving a man from a place he would never look, and tonight she just wanted to be seen, even if only for the wrong reason. Damien tilted his head. "You're shaking." She didn't answer. He walked slowly to the side table, poured tea into 2 small cups, and handed one to her without touching her hand. "If this is a performance," he said gently, "you're trying too hard to play a part you don't understand." Lena swallowed, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. The heat burned her palms, grounding her. "I'm not a professional," she said quietly. "Clearly," he replied. "So, why are you here?" The words hovered, then broke. "Because I'm leaving, and you won't remember me. And She stopped. "I wanted to pretend just for a moment that someone like me could stay in your world, even if I had to lie to do it." His eyes flickered, not in judgment, but something closer to disbelief. He looked at her again. Really looked, and something about the way she said it, the rawness, the unguarded honesty, stripped the room of pretense. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena." "That's better," he murmured, "much better than pretending to be someone you're not." He sat down, motioned to the chair across from him. "Then come sit, Lena. I don't need a fantasy. But I wouldn't mind a real conversation." Lena hesitated for a breath, then walked slowly across the room and sat down in the chair opposite him. The dress she wore didn't feel like hers. It clung to her too closely, revealing more than she was comfortable with. She tugged at the hem unconsciously, wishing for the softness of her usual hoodie and jeans. Damien sipped his tea in silence, watching her with a gaze that was neither cold nor warm, but observant, like he was waiting for the truth to unfold without pushing for it. "You're not what I expected tonight," he said eventually. Lena looked up, startled. "What did you expect?" He gave a faint, amused breath. "Someone rehearsed, someone with confidence, someone who knows how to play the game." She looked down at the cup in her hands, then back at him. "And instead, you got a girl who borrowed a dress and can't keep her hands from shaking." "Exactly," he said, "which is why I didn't ask you to leave." She didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It wrapped around them gently, like a shared secret. Damien leaned back in his chair, stretching his injured leg slightly, and let out a sigh. "You know," he said, "in my world, people pretend all the time. They pretend to want deals, to care about causes, to love. You can see it in the way they smile too long, or in the way their hands never stop moving. But you're pretending not to care that you're terrified." Lena blinked, her lips parting. No one had ever read her that quickly. "How do you know?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Because I was that way once," he said, When I was younger, when I thought pretending would keep me from breaking. He looked out the window for a moment, then back at her. But eventually, you realize that the armor becomes the prison. She sat still, absorbing his words. They weren't flirtation. They weren't manipulation. They were too honest for that. "You're not what I expected either," she said after a pause. "I thought you'd be colder." "You thought I'd ask you to undress?" he asked bluntly, but not cruelly. She flushed. "Maybe." He smiled faintly. "Would it have surprised you if I did?" She nodded. "But not in the way you think." He tilted his head. "Then how?" "It would have hurt, because it would have meant this whole thing was a mistake." Damien set his tea down. "And what would make it not a mistake?" "Talking, like this," she said, "being seen, not used." There was a stillness between them then that wasn't awkward, but electric. She wasn't seducing him, and he wasn't performing power. They were just two people, alone at midnight, both too afraid to admit how rare this kind of moment was. Damien reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to her. She unfolded it and found a pencil sketch done quickly but skillfully of a hospital window, a tray table, and a hand resting over a copy of The Little Prince. "You drew this?" she asked, breath catching. He nodded. "It's how I remembered you before I knew your name. You left that book." Lena's heart jumped. "I didn't think you noticed." "I notice everything that matters," he said, "especially when it's the only real thing in the room." She blinked fast, unsure if her eyes were stinging from emotion or exhaustion. "I should go," she whispered. He nodded slowly, not stopping her, but as she stood and walked toward the door, he said quietly, "Thank you for pretending tonight. It showed me something real." She turned halfway, meeting his gaze. It wasn't all pretend. Then she left, her steps silent, but the weight in her chest louder than anything she had ever carried. The next morning, Lena returned to her routine as if nothing had happened. Her final shift ended quietly. She turned in her ID badge, signed the paperwork, and left the hospital with a numb calmness in her chest. No one noticed her absence. No one asked where she'd been the night before. She didn't expect them to. She told herself that what happened in room 917 was a one-night illusion, intimate, but ultimately inconsequential. Damien Cross would leave that place and return to his empire. She would move on, just another invisible girl carrying too many secrets and not enough confidence. She tucked away the memory like a fragile glass figure on a high shelf, untouchable, but still there. 1 week passed, then 2. Lena focused on finding small freelance projects while applying to postgraduate programs. Her phone buzzed one rainy afternoon as she sat cross-legged on her bed, editing a presentation slide for a nonprofit center. The message came from an unknown number with only a name at the bottom, Damien Cross. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. The message was brief. "I'm building something. I'd like your input. Can you meet?" Below it was an address in the city and a time. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. She almost didn't go. She stared at the screen for hours, deleting the message and restoring it twice. But curiosity had always been louder than caution in her heart. She arrived at the location the next day, dressed simply, her hair tied back, portfolio under her arm. It was a small office space, half renovated, with paint swatches pinned to walls and architectural blueprints rolled across a long table. He was already there, standing at the far end, talking to 2 contractors. When he saw her, he dismissed them quietly. "You came," he said, voice even. "I didn't expect you to text," she replied. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I almost didn't." He gestured for her to follow him through the space. "I'm opening a long-term care facility," he explained, "for trauma recovery, private funding, minimal press. People need healing without being observed." She nodded, unsure why he was telling her all this. He stopped in front of a large, blank room with natural light spilling through high windows. I want this space to feel like it belongs to the patients, not to the doctors or donors. I want softness, quiet, design that doesn't apologize for being gentle. She blinked. You want me to design it? He looked at her. You saw me when no one else did. That qualifies you more than any firm I could hire. Her throat tightened. Why me? Because you knew how to give me silence without making it feel empty. She stared at the room for a long moment, then slowly opened her portfolio. He walked with her as she laid out sketches and ideas. They talked for over an hour about lighting, flow, temperature control, about textures and scent and memory. He wasn't cold, he wasn't flirty. He was present. When they finished, he reached into a file and handed her a small folder. Preliminary contract. You can look it over, revise it, send back notes. She nodded, stunned. Is this professional now? As professional as it needs to be, he said, but also not pretending we're strangers. She hesitated. So you remember everything? He held her gaze. I remembered you long before you knocked on my door. The words settled over her like a slow tide. She sat down, unable to form a response. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. I knew you left that book. I knew you watched me during rounds, always from behind a clipboard, never speaking unless I spoke first. I watched you watching me. Her mouth parted slightly. Why didn't you say anything? Because it was rare, he said, to be looked at like a person when everyone else sees a name or a title, and I didn't want to shatter that. She swallowed hard. So, that night, why did you let me pretend? He exhaled. Because I wanted to know if you'd choose truth when it mattered. And you did. She nodded slowly. And what now? Now, he said, you help me build a place where more people get a chance to stop pretending too. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened, just enough for him to see that his words had reached the place she didn't let anyone touch. The following weeks unfolded with surprising ease. Lena began working on the design full-time, splitting her days between sketches at home and quiet meetings in the evolving space. Damien gave her full creative control, but their conversations went far beyond fabrics and floor plans. They spoke about music, the smell of rain, the weight of unspoken dreams. He never brought up the night she entered his room, pretending to be someone she wasn't. And she never asked him if he had kept the sketch she left behind. It existed between them like a shared confession, one that didn't need to be repeated. They grew into a rhythm that defied definition. He began showing up earlier than needed, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with books he thought she'd like. She left notes on the corners of blueprints, little jokes or observations he'd circle, and return with responses. One evening, as the sun melted behind the city skyline, they stood side by side reviewing fabric samples when Damien's hand brushed hers. She didn't pull away, but he didn't press further either. That was the thing. With him he never rushed. Not with decisions, not with people, and certainly not with her. Still, there were moments. Small, charged, and impossibly loud in their silence. One night, a sudden thunderstorm forced them both to stay late at the site. The wind howled against the windows as power flickered. She sat on the floor with her knees tucked under her, sipping tea while he adjusted the emergency lights. When he returned, he sat across from her and simply watched her for a long time. "You're not afraid of storms," he said. She shook her head. "They're honest. You can feel them coming." "I used to be afraid of silence," he admitted, "until I realized it's where people hide what matters most." She didn't answer, but she looked at him in a way that said she understood. The tension between them became a quiet thread, never spoken aloud but always there. Her friends noticed the change in her voice when she talked about her work. Her mother, during a rare phone call, asked if she was seeing someone. Lena didn't know how to explain that she was and wasn't, that she had never kissed him, never even held his hand for longer than a second, but that somehow she felt more naked in his presence than she ever had in her life. One night, she arrived late to the site, flustered from a subway delay, rain soaking the hem of her pants. Damien was waiting by the window, a towel in one hand, a warm drink in the other. He handed her both without a word. As she dried off, he sat nearby and said, "Do you ever think about that night?" She paused. "Yes." "Do you regret it?" She considered for a moment. "No, it was the only way I knew how to be brave." He nodded, looking away. "You know I haven't touched anyone since then?" Her heart stuttered. "Why?" "Because I haven't wanted to, not unless it meant something." She didn't reply. Her hands clenched the towel tighter. "I don't know what this is," she said quietly. "I don't know what we're building besides a healing center." "Maybe it's both," he said. "A place to heal and the person to do it with." She turned to him fully for the first time in days. "Then why won't you kiss me?" His jaw flexed. He stood slowly, walked toward her, but didn't touch her. "Because the second I do," he said, voice low, "I'll want everything. And I'm not sure if you're ready to be someone's everything yet." Her throat closed up. Not because she was afraid, but because he was right. That night, she didn't leave immediately. She stayed, sat beside him on the floor, and in the silence that followed, she let her shoulder lean just slightly against his. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but his hand found hers, fingers barely brushing, and they stayed like that, tethered not by labels or promises, but by the fragile, beautiful knowledge that whatever this was, it mattered, even if they couldn't name it yet. The message came on a Thursday morning, casual in tone, but sharp in consequence. Lena arrived at the design site to find the contractors packing up their equipment and the project manager quietly removing Damien's name from the planning documents. Confused, she approached the assistant coordinator, who only offered a strained expression and a printed memo. Project indefinitely paused. Lead investor withdrawn. Further notice pending. No one would say more. No one had heard from Damien. She tried calling his number, straight to voicemail. She emailed. Nothing. She even went to his office tower downtown, only to be informed by the cold front desk that Mr. Cross was taking an extended personal leave and not accepting visitors. It didn't make sense. He had been there the day before, vibrant and focused, debating over tile colors and natural light. Now he had vanished. For the first few days, Lena convinced herself it was temporary, that he had gone somewhere for business or maybe needed time. But the silence stretched, and so did the weight in her chest. Her designs sat untouched. Her emails remained unread. What unsettled her most wasn't just out of his absence. It was the way he disappeared without a single word to her. She stopped sleeping, stopped sketching. Her appetite vanished. Every time her phone buzzed, hope leapt and fell in the same heartbeat. On the 6th night, unable to bear the unknown, she returned to the hospital. She asked for the staff who had worked during Damien's recovery. Most didn't remember her. Some had transferred. Finally, an older nurse, kind-eyed and quiet, led her to room 917, now empty. The bed was made, the walls bare. It felt smaller than she remembered. Lena stood alone in the doorway for a long time. Then, almost by instinct, she stepped inside and opened the bottom drawer of the bedside cabinet, the one Damien always seemed to reach for when lost in thought. Inside was a worn navy blue notebook, a sketch pad. Her breath caught. She flipped it open with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with drawings, charcoal renderings of her silhouette at a window, her hands holding tea, her face turned slightly away. Dozens of her, always her. Near the back was one sketch that froze her completely. It was from the night she had entered pretending to be someone she wasn't. But the caption written in Damien's handwriting below read, She never had to pretend. I just needed to see it. On the final page there was a note, small and hurried. If you're reading this, I'm sorry I left. I needed to disappear before I said something I couldn't take back. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was just hiding again. D. She sat on the bed, the notebook clutched to her chest, heart pounding with questions and something deeper grief for a connection lost too soon. She thought of all the things he never said, all the things she never dared ask, why he thought leaving would protect her, why he didn't trust her with the truth. She ran her fingers over the sketch on the final page and whispered to the empty room, I wasn't afraid of what you'd say. I was afraid you'd never say anything. She closed the book slowly and stood, her eyes clear now, her mind steady. If he had left to protect her, he had failed. If he had left to protect himself, she could forgive that. But she would not wait in silence. She would find him, not to demand anything, not to beg, but to tell him finally that what they shared wasn't a mistake to be erased. It was the only honest thing either of them had ever known. Lena didn't pack much. A small backpack, her sketch pad, and the navy blue notebook Damien had left behind. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. There was no plan, no address, just a list of places he had once mentioned in passing quiet towns. Shelters he funded anonymously, small libraries he had spoken of, like sacred spaces. She started with the community clinic he had helped build in the southern edge of the city. The receptionist recognized his name, but said he hadn't been seen in weeks. The same answer echoed through the youth center, the art school he once sponsored, the bookstore where he donated every copy of The Little Prince he could find. It felt like chasing the wind. And yet something kept her moving. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was something quieter. A refusal to let silence be the last word between them. On the 9th day, with rain washing the city in cold gray, she reached a remote mountain town listed in the margins of his sketchbook, a scribbled reminder beside a penciled landscape. Cedar Ridge, the only place the air felt honest. She arrived just before dusk. The town was small, nestled between pine trees and mist, the roads narrow and mostly unpaved. She asked for directions to the local retreat center, one run by volunteers and offering wellness programs for veterans and trauma patients. A young woman at the front desk frowned thoughtfully. You mean the guy who teaches drawing on Thursdays? Lena's breath caught. Tall, dark hair, walks with a slight limp. The woman nodded. He's here, keeps to himself, but the kids love him. She waited near the back courtyard, heart pounding with every footstep she imagined. When Damien finally appeared, walking slowly down the gravel path with a sketch roll under one arm, he stopped mid-step when he saw her. For a moment neither of them moved. Rain clung to her coat, hair damp against her cheek. But she didn't care. She walked toward him slowly, never breaking eye contact. When she stood just a few feet away, she spoke first. You left without letting me decide what I wanted. He didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was raw. I was afraid you'd say you didn't want anything more. And if I did, she asked, would you have stayed? His jaw tensed. I didn't think I was the kind of man worth staying for. She stepped closer. You are, but you let your fear speak louder than your faith in me. He looked down, then back at her. I didn't think I had the right to keep you in a world that was never gentle. It's not about the world, she whispered. It's about who I chose to be in it, and I chose you. Damien blinked, once, twice. You came all this way to tell me that? No, she said softly. I came to ask if there's still a place for me beside you. He looked away for a breath, then stepped aside and opened the studio door behind him. Inside, the walls were covered in sketches of her, some rough, some detailed, all drawn from memory. "There's been a place," he said. "I just didn't know if I had the right to keep building it." She walked in, without waiting for permission. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. Fingers laced, silence thick, but no longer uncertain. They didn't kiss, not yet. But something in the air between them shifted. The distance closed. The wound paused. The chapter, perhaps, ready to begin again on honest pages this time. And as they stood side by side in the warmth of a studio built for healing, the rain outside softened, as if the sky, too, had been holding its breath. Lena didn't return to the city that month. Instead, she stayed in Cedar Ridge, sharing days with Damien that unfolded in a quiet rhythm neither of them dared label. They taught weekend art sessions to children from neighboring towns. They painted benches in the garden and made soup from whatever vegetables the volunteers brought in. They didn't talk about the hospital or the night she walked into his room pretending to be someone she wasn't. They didn't talk about what they were to each other now. It wasn't necessary. Everything that needed to be said was spoken in the way he handed her a mug of tea without asking how she liked it, or the way her fingers brushed his shoulder when she passed behind him in the narrow kitchen, lingering just long enough to say, "I see you." One evening, while the mountains glowed gold and the studio smelled faintly of wet charcoal and pine, Damien placed a new sheet of paper on his desk and turned to her. "I want to draw you," he said. Lena raised an eyebrow. "You've already drawn me 100 times." He shook his head. "Those were memories. I want this one to be you now." She hesitated, then nodded. She didn't pose dramatically. She simply sat across from him, one leg tucked under the other, her hair falling over her shoulder, eyes watching him with that quiet intensity he had never been able to escape. He sketched for over an hour, barely speaking. When he finally looked up, she was half asleep, her face softened in the glow of the desk lamp. "Can I ask you something?" she murmured. "Of course." "Why did you stop me that night?" "From leaving?" "From pretending." Damien leaned back in his chair. "Because the moment you said your name, it was the first time I realized I didn't want a performance. I wanted something I could never buy." She was silent for a long moment. "You scared me," she whispered. "Not because of who you were, but because I thought if you knew the real me, you wouldn't stay." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him. "Now I know you're just as scared, but you're still here. So maybe that's what love is, being scared but staying anyway." He didn't answer with words. He set the sketch aside, walked over, and sat beside her. She turned slightly, heart pounding not with fear but with clarity. When he leaned in, the kiss was not urgent. It was gentle, reverent, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for more, only offers what it is. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, and he smiled without opening his eyes. "You're dangerous," he whispered. "Why?" "Because you make me want things I promised myself I'd stopped needing." They didn't rush into declarations. There were no dramatic vows or fireworks, just two people sitting on a wooden floor, knowing that the distance between them had finally disappeared. When Lena returned to the city weeks later, she didn't go alone. Damien walked beside her, not as a statement, not as a headline, but simply as someone who had finally stopped hiding. The Healing Center project resumed, quietly, without press, with new sketches and softer walls and a reading nook filled with copies of The Little Prince. At the opening ceremony, Lena stood beside Damien in a plain white dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm. No one mentioned who she had been or how they met. The world didn't need to know the dare or the dress or the night she knocked on his door. What mattered was that they had built something real from the pieces of who they used to be, not a fairy tale, not a scandal, just a truth that had taken its time. And years later, whenever someone asked Lena how she met her partner, she would only smile and say, "It started with a moment I should have run from, but I stayed, and so did he." Because in the end, it wasn't about a girl pretending to be someone else. It was about the man who saw through the lie and loved the woman hiding beneath it.